So let's begin. We rely so much on email for our careers and for even our personal lives. So much so that many of us even neglect the proper etiquette when it comes to sending an email. And this is because we're just so busy. We're on the go. We receive potentially hundreds of emails every single day. And our reaction is to reply as quickly and efficiently as possible, whether that's from our smartphone, our laptop, our desktop, or our tablet. And therefore, our spelling, grammar, and tone often suffer in our emails. We're going to talk about the following objectives today during this webinar. The first thing we're going to talk about is writing with appropriate tone. The second is developing an understanding of clarity. The third, executing confident writing. The fourth, avoiding chain emails. And then finally, learning how to get what you want. I'd like for you to think about the emails you receive during the day. Think about what they say and what they look like. What are some of your own pet peeves when it comes to receiving emails? Maybe it's when someone doesn't include a subject line and they just leave it blank. Or it's an email that has all capital letters in it, so it's like someone's yelling at you. Or someone who overuses those happy faces or smiley faces, or has some spelling errors in there. Or maybe it's when someone kind of comes across bossy or demeaning in an email. The list really goes on and on. The reason why it's important to recognize some of these pet peeves of our own is because we actually struggle with some of the very same things that irritate us. For example, you might get easily frustrated when someone is too wordy in their email, but you might also find that it's one of your very own struggles and that sometimes you're too wordy as well. The first step to email etiquette really is self-awareness. So keep these pet peeves in mind as we move throughout the presentation. The first thing we're going to talk about is tone, which is how we sound through words. A lot of the time we sound a certain way in letters, emails, and text messages, even if we don't mean to come across that way. And this is called intent versus impact. We may intend for a reader to think or feel a certain way based on the words that we're choosing, but it doesn't always have the same impact, does it? The reader might perceive our messages differently. Now, there are many different types of tone, and I'm going to read a few different sentences on the screen here in a different voice so you can kind of get what I mean. So if I read the first one in a bossy voice, Jen, you need to print 10 copies of the report for our meeting. Or maybe a condescending voice for the second example. Did you really handle the call that way? I wouldn't have done that if I were you. Or unhelpful. I'm not sure. That's not my department. Or even passive-aggressive. Sorry to be a pain, but I'm in a bad mood today. Smiley face. So even if you don't mean to come across a certain way, remember that someone can interpret what you say completely differently from how you intended. When it comes down to it, even though there are many different types of tone, they can be grouped into two main categories, positive and negative. Positivity encourages communication, but negativity sets the wrong tone for effective interaction. Of course, we always want to have a positive tone. So here are some tips on how to do that. First, state what you can do rather than what you can't. Instead of saying something like, sorry, we can't offer a quote for this because the building was built in 1932. Say something like, although we're unable to give you a quote for this particular risk due to the building being built in 1932, we look forward to working together to find a solution or to take a look at another risk. And then second, avoid negative words if possible, like unfortunately, we're sorry, that's not my department, I can't, I won't. Sometimes it's completely unavoidable. However, it's good to reduce the number of negative words that you're using. Notice the difference between these two statements on the screen. We can't find your account. You failed to include the correct address. And then the second, as soon as we receive the correct address, we will bind your account. I hope that you can see that by removing the negative wording of can't and you failed, we changed the sentence completely. While we're still letting the reader know that we need something from them, we're taking the negativity away and we're not blaming them as much as we are in the first sentence. Now that we've talked about tone, let's talk about why it's important to be clear in our communications. Clarity means a lot of things. It means not rambling, providing enough detail without diluting the message, and it also means writing without confusing the reader. Now let's take a look at an email that rambles and provides way too much detail, all while confusing the reader. As you can see, there's a lot of information on this screen. Now, while you're reading this to yourself, I bet you won't need to read through the whole email to feel overwhelmed and confused. So just take a moment or two and try to read through it. This email isn't clear. It includes way too much information, and the reader doesn't know what to do first. It's also very difficult to read because it's in paragraph format. Now let's look at a cleaner version of this email. Take a moment and notice the difference here. Hopefully you're seeing how this is much easier to read. And one reason is because bullet points are a great tool for ensuring clear writing. Paragraphs are very difficult to read, not only on a computer screen, but definitely on smartphones as well. And I'm sure that a lot of you read your email on your cell phones, especially if you're traveling. So you know it can be difficult to read long emails on your phone. Using bullet points, though, empowers the reader to simply type their message right next to the bullet point, but in a different color font, for example. Also, Ashley asked a question up front in this email, which makes it very clear for Michael to understand what he needs to do. And this is a great example of taking a lot of information and breaking it up so it's clear and easy to read. Aside from long emails that are difficult to read, using jargon, acronyms, and slang also contributes to unclear writing. Think of what you do every day. What jargon do you use? What acronyms do you use? And you can see a few examples here on the screen. Just because we're all in the insurance industry doesn't mean that we all communicate the same way. Personal lines is different from commercial lines, which is different from medical. Our roles are also very different. Some of us underwrite, others are producers or customer service representatives. Some of us work in claims, others are office managers. So don't assume anyone knows what you're talking about. It's very, very important to be clear, concise, and direct in your emails. So far, we've talked about tone and clarity, and another important part of email etiquette is writing with confidence. But what exactly does this mean? It means that it's okay to apologize if you made a mistake, but you don't need to apologize for something that you didn't do. And as humans, we tend to want to apologize if we feel bad about something, even if it's not our fault. In business, this typically makes you look like you don't have confidence in yourself, though, and in your abilities and in what your company stands for. For example, if an insured sends over the incorrect spelling of their last name, you didn't make the mistake, the insured did. So when they ask for the correction, rather than saying something like, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," or "I apologize," simply say something like, "Thank you for the correction. I'm attaching the endorsement with the correct spelling." It's certainly appropriate to apologize when you've made a mistake. When it comes to staying confident, though, say what you can do. So stay positive. Try to stay away from wimpy words that show you're unsure or you're uneasy about a decision. Wimpy words are words and phrases like unfortunately, I wish I could, I'm afraid that, I didn't mean to, I'm not sure, etc. These words and phrases don't instill confidence in the person to whom you're communicating. You should portray a message of confidence in yourself, your team, and your company. Those reading your communications will be more inclined to trust you and feel like you know what you're talking about. So let's look at an example of writing that's not confident. And I'll give you a moment just to read through the example on the screen. How does this make you feel? How many times did Bill write in such a way that wasn't confident? He says, unfortunately, it appears, I'm afraid that, my hands are tied, I apologize for the inconvenience, and even I believe, which doesn't sound very confident either. So next we're going to talk about chain emails. Addressing the topic of chain emails is critical to teaching good email etiquette, and these happen during our workday on a regular basis and inhibit productivity. Have you ever been forwarded an email where the sender doesn't type any sort of explanation? They just forward the chain of emails assuming you will know what to do with it? It's important to realize the damage that chain emails can cause, as well as how to combat them. A chain email causes decreased productivity, service misses, confusion, lost time, and unclear ownership. A chain email is often created because there's a lot of back and forth happening between two or more people, or several people just wind up being copied on the emails. An account or a project might need a lot of give and take type of information, which then results in a chain email. So I have an example here on this slide of what part of a chain email might look like. Now, it's originally between two people at the very bottom of the screen, between Mike and Michelle. And that's before Michelle decides to loop Jill in at the very end, at the top there. Michelle simply types FYI to Jill without any sort of explanation or question or can you help me with this. Typically, our chain emails can be much longer than this and much more confusing. This is just an example. So what can we do to make sure we're taking ownership of the chain email and avoiding any sort of confusion? One way to combat these chains is to have a meeting, if possible. If that's not possible, a phone conversation can help alleviate a lot of the back and forth. You should also explain what you would like the recipient to do so he or she isn't lost or in the dark when they receive a chain email. You shouldn't simply forward the email without even saying anything. You can also change the subject line. Many times a chain email morphs into something else entirely and it needs a new subject line because the subject line no longer pertains to that topic. But many people choose to keep it intact even though the subject has changed entirely. Don't be afraid to change the subject line. Finally, delete unnecessary information. If half of the email chain is unimportant or irrelevant, don't be afraid to delete it because this makes it easier for the person receiving the chain. They won't have to skim through as much information that's not important to begin with. So far, we've talked about tone, which is how we sound through words. We've also talked about clarity and providing enough detail. We've talked about confident writing and avoiding some of those wimpy words and phrases, as well as how to avoid email chains. Another important part of email etiquette is being able to get what you want from someone else. I'm sure we all have emailed someone with a question and never even received a response. Or maybe you received a response, but it really wasn't what you were looking for. So now we're going to talk about how to address these issues and tips for getting what you want. The first step is to make sure your reader feels like you care. Don't make it all about you and what you want. Take a second just to read this example on the screen. This is not really focused on Ben because of the overuse of the word I. I was happy, I am hopeful, I think, I will call you, and so on. To show the reader that you care, try avoiding using I and me too much. It can be difficult, but give it a shot. Instead, use you, us, and we. Let's take a look at a slightly different version of the same example. This version focuses more on Ben. Notice the incorporation of the word you. Thank you for your time, your interest, as you mentioned. Thank you for your support, and so on. All we did was change very small words, but it does make a difference. Also, knowing when to pick up the phone versus sending an email is important for getting what you want. Let's take a look at this table on the screen to see when it would be more appropriate to send an email versus pick up the phone. It'd be more appropriate to pick up the phone if you needed an answer quickly, if there's a chance you'd be misunderstood, if you want to have a conference call with a few people, for example. It'd be more appropriate to send an email rather than picking up the phone if you need to document something, if you need to stay in touch while you're out of the office, or if you're communicating with someone in a different time zone and they're not going to be available for a phone call. Another great way to improve the chance of getting what you want is paying closer attention to your subject lines. I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the chain email section, but subject lines are a very powerful tool when it comes to email etiquette. And I want to give you a few tips to help you get the most out of your subject line space. So in your subject lines, be clear and concise, but descriptive. Resist using any jargon. Don't spamify your email with subject lines like just for you or read this now or help. Subject lines like that tend to make someone think that it might be spam. And of course, ask for an action if that's what you need. If, for example, you have a question about policy limits, why not include that in the subject line along with the quote or the policy number? Let's take a look at 3 different examples of subject lines. Now, they're all very similar. The first just says question. The second has a little more information. And the third has even a little more information. If you were the reader, you would have the clearest idea of what this email was about with the third example. Question about limits for quote 1, 2, 3. Now this is something small that you can do, adding a question or additional information, but it's not something that we often think of, and it really can provide clarity and help you get what you want from people and get people to open up your email as well. So far, we've talked about tone, clarity, confidence, chain emails, getting what you want. I'd like to wrap up with a few general email tips that are common questions a lot of people have when it comes to writing emails. First, avoid typing in all capital letters. This can be interpreted as being yelled at, and it also doesn't look very professional. The second thing is always use a salutation like "Good morning, Joe," for example. And I'd like everyone to notice that the comma comes after Joe and not after morning. Putting a comma after morning when using a name in the salutation is a common mistake that people make. If you include a name, you only need one comma after the name. If you don't include a name, you would just put the comma after morning. And a closing is also important. Adding your phone number like you see there on the right-hand side and extension is very helpful in case your reader wants to pick up the phone and call you about your email. You don't necessarily have to include your entire signature every time you reply to an email. You can amend that so that it's just your name and some quick contact information so that people can get in touch with you easily. And an email should always have a beginning, middle, and end. And I tend to think of this as the past, present, and future. So a beginning for an email could be, "Thanks for meeting with me on Monday." The middle should be the bulk of your email, of what you want to talk about. And then the end should be an action item or something else for the future. And keep your paragraph short, no more than a few lines. We talked about that earlier. It's just easier to read. Shorter emails, emails with bullet points or numbers in them, numbered steps. And be very careful with humor as well, especially sarcasm, because you never know how someone's going to interpret your email. We talked about that with intent versus impact. Just because you want to come across funny, innocently, that doesn't mean that's how someone's going to receive it. Now, this might disappoint some people because I know that there are many individuals who love using emoticons. Those are the happy faces and sad faces, but we really should not be using them in our business communications just because it's unprofessional. And avoid using text messaging shorthand as well, like LOL, hey, things like that. And then finally, refer back to your previous communications in the first paragraph of your email so that the reader understands what's going on right away. You're not just hitting them with some information and they really don't have any background or they don't recall what your last email communication was. It's good to give a summary first. Now, that was not a comprehensive list, but they are several important things to remember when you're writing business emails. So to wrap up today, we talked about writing with appropriate tone, developing an understanding of clarity, executing confident writing, avoiding chain emails, and learning how to get what you want. And I'd like to finish, before I talk a little bit more about the upcoming webinars and my contact information, I wanted to finish with a John Wooden quote. It isn't what you do, but how you do it, which is very true when it comes to business writing and email etiquette. While you may be very efficient when you're responding to all your emails, how are you portraying yourself to other people? That's really the important message. Think about how you are not only representing yourself, but how you're representing your company when it comes to communicating through email.